important with the ever more increasing capacities of surveillance technology. In describing privacy's significance, I might paraphrase journalist Glenn Greenwald, who last night asked an audience to consider what happens to democracy when a free polity, that is, a system of public officials and private citizens, no longer exists. What does it mean when government goes private and the citizenry becomes fully public to it? To this end, a few weeks ago, our Center for Digital Society and Data Studies presented a symposium on the conflict between Apple and the FBI. And last night, our School of Journalism held a special viewing of Citizen 4 as part of their Journalism on Screen series at the Lost Cinema. Mr. Greenwald, who was featured in the Oscar-winning documentary on Edward Snowden's release of the NSA data collection programs, was on hand for a lively discussion after the showing. And this fall, we will reconvene our downtown lecture series at the Fox Theater with faculty experts from across campus speaking on key legal, cultural, and security issues surrounding privacy. Tonight's event is undoubtedly a highlight in this year's programming. I am especially grateful to Dr. David Collier, Director of the School of Journalism, and Dr. Lydia Brunig, SBS's Director of Outreach, for their inspiration and hard work in bringing us all together. I am also thankful for the vision and enthusiasm of my friend, Arizona First Amendment lawyer and free speech activist, Don Moon. His Don Bennett Moon Foundation is financially underwriting this evening's conversation. Another collaborator has been First Look Media's journalism outlet, The Intercept, which is live streaming this discussion across the globe tonight. I also thank the college's Center for the Philosophy of Freedom, the School of Information, and its Center for Digital Society and Data Studies, the School of Journalism, and the Department of Linguistics. A bit of housekeeping before we get started. Please, no flash photography and recording. And for the sake of our panelists in the audience and, well, your own privacy, please turn off your cell phones. Let me begin with our moderator, Ms. Nuala O'Connor, the president and CEO of the Washington, D.C.-based Center for Democracy and Technology. Ms. O'Connor is an internationally recognized expert in internet and technology policy, especially in the areas of information governance and the potential for the internet to support individual freedom. She has committed her career to finding policy solutions to affect positive outcomes. Ms. O'Connor serves on numerous nonprofit boards and was chairman of the board of the International Association of Privacy Professionals. Before joining the Center for Democracy and Technology, she was at the U.S. Department of Commerce, where she served as Deputy Director for Policy and Strategic Planning, Chief Counsel for Technology, and Chief Privacy Officer. And she was also the first Chief Privacy Officer at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Ms. O'Connor holds degrees from Princeton, Harvard, and Georgetown University's Law Center. Welcome, Nuala O'Connor. Journalist Glenn Greenwald is acclaimed as one of the 25 most influential public commentators by The Atlantic, one of America's top 10 opinion writers by Newsweek, and one of the top 100 global thinkers by Foreign Policy magazine. A former constitutional law and civil rights litigator, he was a columnist for The Guardian when contacted by Edward Snowden. The work earned the paper a Pulitzer Prize. Mr. Greenwald is a founding editor of The Intercept and a frequent guest on CNN, MSNBC, and numerous other television and radio outlets. He has won numerous awards for his reporting, including the I.F. Stone Award for Early Career Investigative Reporting, the Polk Award for National Security Reporting, and the Pioneer Award from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. He is the author of several bestsellers, including How Would a Patriot Act?, With Liberty and Justice for Some, and most recently, No Place to Hide, Edward Snowden, the NSA, and the U.S. Surveillance State. Please welcome Glenn Greenwald. Friends of the College of SBS will readily recognize our third speaker, Dr. Noam Chomsky, Professor Emeritus at MIT and the founder of modern linguistics. I'm pleased to say that tonight marks his third appearance at Centennial Hall. The author of 100 books and countless articles, Professor Chomsky's ideas have not only revolutionized linguistics, they have indelibly shaped every field in the behavioral, cognitive, and mathematical sciences. He is, according to the Chicago Tribune, the most cited living author. Tonight, of course, you will hear Noam Chomsky, the public intellectual, the self-described libertarian socialist and anarchist, a critic of established politicians on both the left and the right. Over 1 million Facebook friends keep up with his consistently hard-hitting critiques of U.S. policy. Please welcome back Noam Chomsky to the University of Arizona. Got it? And finally, Mr. Edward Snowden is joining us remotely from an undisclosed location in Russia. He made headlines in 2013 when, while employed as an NSA contractor, he divulged top-secret information about the NSA's and the CIA's
Thank you so much.
Among the NSA secrets leaked by Mr. Snowden was a court order that compelled Verizon to turn over metadata for millions of its subscribers. He also revealed the existence of PRISM, a data mining program that reportedly gave the NSA and the FBI direct access to the servers of Google, Facebook, and several other internet companies. As a result of his disclosures, the U.S. government charged Mr. Snowden under the Espionage Act. His actions sparked international debates over information privacy, mass surveillance, and government secrecy. In addition to his appearance in Citizen4, Mr. Snowden is the subject of a soon-to-be-released biographical political thriller produced and directed by Academy Award winner Oliver Stone. Mr. Edward Snowden.
Good to be in Arizona.
So we have here tonight an outstanding lineup. You may be interested to know that over the past couple of years, each has appeared with one of the other speakers in this or that public forum. But tonight, on this stage, they are together for the first time. Enjoy.
So good evening, everyone. And again, I'm Nuala O'Connor, the president and CEO of the Center for Democracy and Technology, an advocacy group focused on your digital civil liberties. It's such a great pleasure to be here in Tucson at the wonderful University of Arizona. Such a beautiful campus, such a majestic setting to talk about our freedoms. I want to thank Dean John Paul Jones and the entire team from the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences for hosting us tonight. Thank you also to the team that put this together. It was not easy, as you can imagine, logistically and technologically, to get all of us on one stage. And since our time is short, we want to make it really clear that the speakers are already known to you and probably available to you online, their resumes, so we are going to dispense with all of that and spend the most time listening to their views on privacy in the digital age. Given also the size of this audience, we are not going to be taking live questions. It's just too unwieldy. There are too many of you. But hopefully many of you got to participate in our online app at Two Shoes, and we crowdsourced a lot of the questions tonight. I'll try to call out the ones that we found from you online and on Twitter and Facebook and a whole bunch of other places. We've consolidated these for brevity and for general themes, and we appreciate your input. We thank everyone here for their time in person, and those of you watching online, we welcome you and thank you for your attention to us here in the beautiful Centennial Hall. So, without further ado, Noam Chomsky, you have been a leading public intellectual in this country and around the world for 6 decades. You have explored the creation of self, the dominance of the state, and the tension between the two. Please help us today put in context the current debate around privacy, the boundaries between self and state, the boundaries between self and corporate interest. 25 years onward from the initial commercialization of the internet, where are we, Professor Chomsky, and where do we go from here?
Well, we might start from the commercialization of the internet, which is an interesting phenomenon. The internet was developed, like most of the advanced economy, largely within the state sector, the dynamic, creative state sector. Actually, I was working in the lab where the early stages of the internet were developed, a Pentagon-funded laboratory at MIT. After the long period of risky, creative work at taxpayer expense, the internet was handed over to a private enterprise for marketing and profit-making. That's pretty much the way much of the economy works. Exactly how that happened is a little bit murky, but it did happen and it's normal. The internet was intended by the early designers to be a free, open means of communication which would be democratized. Originally, it was intended actually for scientists to interchange freely, but then more broadly for the general public, and the hope and expectation that it would widen horizons, provide quick access to information, allow for free interchange of thoughts and ideas, and just contribute to a more healthy, vital, democratic society. Once it gets commercialized, that changes. There are, it's not a secret, systems of concentrated, mostly unaccountable power, some of them private, some of them state, and they're not in the business of fostering democracy and freedom. They're in the business of expanding their own power, authority, and domination. And in various ways, they have sought to shape and mold this system so that it serves those purposes. But it's really up to us. Technology is basically neutral. You can use it to oppress, you can use it to liberate. A hammer doesn't care whether it's used to build a house or to smash somebody's skull in. It's up to us, the public, to determine what the future of this remarkable instrument will become, recognizing the forces that will try to impede it and shape and mold it for their own purposes.
Thank you so much. Glenn Greenwald, you are an important actor in this narrative. You've been described as an activist, a journalist, maybe a hack. How do you describe yourself? What is your self-identity and what is your role? What do you want people to know about where you've come and what you've done?
Well, I'm actually more or less comfortable with all of those titles and many of the other ones that have been applied to me. You know, ultimately, I don't really see journalism as being this kind of cloistered profession of people who are called journalists and who exclusively possess the right to engage to exercise the right of a free press. I look at my duties first and foremost as a citizen, just like every other citizen. And among the tools available to me, guaranteed by the Constitution, is a free press. And originally that was intended to be used by every citizen as a means not to gain employment or to earn a livelihood, but to answer the critical question that was supposed to face the United States at its founding, which is, if we create this centralized government and vest it with all of these extreme powers, how do we prevent it from replicating this tyrannical force that the colonists had just liberated themselves from as a result of this really risky war? And the answer was supposed to be there were going to be all these mechanisms that were designed to check the wielding of the factions that possess the greatest power. And one of the most critical checks was supposed to be a free press, the ability to stand up to people who wield power and to say, you're making these claims, and rather than mindlessly ingest them or repeat them, I'm actually going to challenge them, and I'm going to investigate them. Rather than letting you operate in the dark, I'm going to shine a light on what it is that you're doing so that the citizenry is aware of the things that you're doing with the power that we have given to you. And so whether you call that activism or whether you call that journalism or whether you call it treason or whatever else you might want to describe it as, you know, to me, much more important than the label is the substance of that function. And to me, the core of that function, at least as I try and embrace it and try and practice it, is to make certain that the people who wield the greatest political and economic power are incapable of doing that with no restraints, but instead constantly meet all sorts of critical scrutiny and impediments and attempts to push back against it. And I think everything that we've done in this matter and in everything else I try and do in my journalism is about trying to make things a lot more difficult for those who wield the greatest power.
Thank you. Edward Snowden. Ed, you've been called by some a traitor and some a patriot. How do you see yourself, and what is your role in today's debate? And why were you the one chosen to play it?
I've said before that whistleblowers are sort of elected by circumstance. The idea here is that we are a government that derives its legitimacy from the consent of the governed. But that consent is only meaningful if it's informed. Now, we're supposed to have a system of checks and balances to ensure that that is always the case. We know what's going on. We have the ability to cast our votes to direct the activities of our government. We have an executive that should be checked by the courts that should be directed by the Congress. And this sort of virtuous cycle is supposed to be founded on the idea of competition between them. However, things have changed increasingly over the existence of our nation from when we were first founded, and we were very allergic to the idea of a strong central power, to the very recent past, where we have a government that seems to be almost completely unrestrained by law or the Constitution. And we've had former government officials say things like, we do what's illegal immediately, the unconstitutional takes a little bit longer. But the idea here is that a nation is comprised of people, as is a community, as is a government, as is every structure in which we cooperate with one another. And we all have not just a right, but a responsibility to alert those around us, the other members of our society, of wrongdoing when and where we see it. Now, there were no whistleblower protection laws that applied to intelligence agency contractors like myself in my position. And as I gained seniority, as I gained awareness of what the government was doing, as I gained sort of higher and higher clearances and access to more and more classified information, I saw that the public declarations of government officials were very different from the actual reality of what was happening. In fact, we were operating beyond the law in a way that many argued was unconstitutional. And the courts have since confirmed that, declaring these programs likely unconstitutional and even calling them Orwellian in their scope. And it's important to understand, how did we get here? How did we reach a point where the individual is all that society can rely upon? Because, of course, we don't want the individual citizen, the individual conscience, to be the last safeguard. Now, giving false testimony to Congress is a felony in our country. And just a few months before the NSA activities showing that they had indiscriminately intercepted the communications of every American, as well as everyone else around the world, the 95% of the human population that lives beyond the borders of the United States, when we were seeing videotaped, sworn testimony by federal officials, it looked a lot like this.
Does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
It does not.
Not wittingly. There are cases where they could inadvertently, perhaps, collect, but not wittingly.
Now, in his defense, after that became quite publicly known to be false, he first said he was being too cute by half. And then when he realized that was a felony, he quickly amended that to saying he forgot about the program that was monitoring everyone in the country. Now, reasonable people can disagree about where we should draw the lines of surveillance policy. No one argues that we should shut down every surveillance program in the country. No one says we should list the names of everyone who's under surveillance on the newspaper on an individualized basis. But if we are to have a democracy, if we are to be partner to government rather than subject to it, we must know at least the broad powers and privileges that the government is claiming. We must know both what they are doing in our name and what they're doing against us, or else we're no longer directed by the public. We're ruled from above.
So we're going to start from the very beginning with the fundamental question of what is privacy. Glenn Greenwald calls himself a constitutional lawyer, maybe a recovering constitutional lawyer, I'm not sure.
Recovering.
So he knows that there is no right to privacy ensconced in the U.S. Constitution, although there are state constitutions that use the word privacy. So my question really for the whole panel, and we'll take it one by one, is what is privacy? The author Jeffrey Ritter wrote that privacy is a contractual bond. As we know, our friends in Europe think of it as a human right. In Latin America, the construct is habeas data, my data myself. I personally like that one. At CDT, we think of the construct as digital self, that your data is an extension of your person, an extension of self, and should be treated as part of the body. Where should we be drawing the line between the self and the state, the self and the corporate interest, the self and each other? I'm going to start with Noam again.
Well, I think we should start from a principle which derives from the Enlightenment and classical liberalism, the principle that any form of authority, domination, and hierarchy must be assumed initially to be illegitimate. It carries a burden of proof. The burden of proof is on the structure of authority. It has to demonstrate that it has legitimacy in specific circumstances. And sometimes it should be a pretty high burden. There are times when that burden can be met. So if I'm walking in the street with my granddaughter and she runs out to the street and I grab her back and pull her back, I think I can justify that authority. But justification of authority is extremely difficult. And if you look carefully, it's a burden that can very rarely be met. So the issue in this case is typically security. And it's therefore, we have one of the good things about the United States is that by comparative standards, it's quite an open society. We have access to documentary records from the government, which is unusual, maybe unique by historical standards. And we can look at it, and we can investigate to what extent government actions have been motivated by security. And when you investigate that, I think what you discover is, first of all, that there are different kinds of security. There's security for state power. That's constantly protected. There's security for the concentrations of economic power, corporate interests and so on, that are highly influential, overwhelmingly influential in determining state policy. And we find plenty of attention to their security. And then there's the question of security of the population. That turns out to be a very low consideration of very little significance. It's constantly either ignored or overruled in the interests of the real concerns of security. I think I can't demonstrate it here, but I think it's a challenge to look at the record, which we can investigate, and I think that's what you find. And that strongly suggests that the claim to legitimacy of authority in this case is on very shaky foundations and should be very seriously questioned in case after case.
Glenn, it's a penumbral right. So how are we doing?
Well, at the risk of picking a fight with the moderator, earlier that I planned
Come on.
all right, you don't have to
Bring it.
urge me too much. I'm happy to do that. No, I do think actually, when you talk about privacy, the starting point is the fact that it is actually protected in the U.S. Constitution, albeit not with the word privacy. If you look at probably the amendment to the Bill of Rights, which received the greatest attention, it was the idea that the government had no power of general warrants, meaning what the king used to do is order entire villages or neighborhoods or cities subjected to house-by-house searches, that instead you had to have this particular suspicion, reasonable cause in fact, probable cause, that the person was engaged in some sort of wrongdoing before the state had the right to inspect their papers or persons. That is, in essence, the crux of the definition of privacy. And in so many ways, the debates we're having now were settled over 200 years ago when the government said, we don't have mass surveillance in this country, it's a violation of fundamental rights. The only kind of surveillance that is permitted, as Professor Chomsky said, is when the burden that's on the government is met by them going into a court and saying this particular individual has engaged in all likelihood in some sort of wrongdoing, and therefore we can invade their home, read their papers, and the like. But I want to just take a step back, because I think the question of what is privacy is a really critical question to ask. And the reason is because a lot of times people treat it as though it's this kind of abstraction. Like, we understand why physical needs, like the need for food or shelter or healthcare, are things that are these immediate, urgent needs that are fundamental to who we are. But a lot of people are really willing to be dismissive about the right to privacy, to treat it as this kind of distant, remote value that even for those of us who sort of think it's a good thing, we're not really willing to say that it's something we demand be protected. And I'm sure all of you in this room have heard the rationale that's used by people who want to belittle the right to privacy, and I bet you a lot of you even think it yourselves, which is the idea that, well, you know what? I'm not one of the bad people. I'm not planning any terrorist attacks. I'm not engaged in violent crimes, and therefore I don't actually have anything to hide. I don't mind if the government invades my privacy. And what's really fascinating about that I found over the last few years is that even the people who say that, the people who say they don't actually value their privacy, they don't actually mean it at all. And the proof of it is they do all sorts of things to safeguard their own privacy. I mean, we all have things to hide. There are things that everyone in this room would be willing to have their spouse or their best friend or their physician or their lawyer or their psychiatrist know, but would be mortified to have anybody else know. And the people who say they don't value privacy, they do things like they put and use locks on their bedroom and bathroom door. They put passwords on their email and their social media account. They do all sorts of things to ensure there's a place they can go in the world to think and reason and explore without the judgmental eyes of other people being cast upon them. This is really critical to human freedom. And you should do this experiment. It's something I've done every single time over the last 3 years when somebody said to me, you know what, I'm not a terrorist, I'm not a bad person, I'm not planning any crimes, I don't actually have anything to hide. I do the same thing every time someone says it to me, which is I take out a sheet of paper and I write my email address on it. And I say, here's my email address, and what I want you to do when you get home is I want you to email to me all of the passwords to all of your email and social media accounts, and not just the nice, respectable ones from work in your name, but all of them. And I just want to be able to troll through what you're doing online and publish it under your name, because after all, if you're not a bad person, you should have nothing to hide. And, to this day, not a single person has taken me up on this offer. I check that email account really frequently. It's a very lonely and desolate place. And the reason is because we really understand instinctively, without this abstract debate, why privacy is so critical. We are social animals. We have a need for other people to know and see what we're doing, which is why we post things about ourselves online. But we also have the need to be able to do things without other people watching, because when other people are watching what you're doing, you're much more likely to engage in decision-making that's the byproduct of societal orthodoxies or external expectations and not a byproduct of your own agency and independence. And so when we lose privacy, when we allow ourselves to live in a society where we're susceptible to being monitored at all times, we lose a really critical part of what it means to be a free and fulfilled individual. And as Professor Chomsky was saying, we should not allow that to happen in any circumstance, except when the government demonstrates there's a really compelling need.
And to have the quiet spaces for creativity and soul searching. And Ed Snowden, in the days and weeks and months after the revelations that you sparked became clear to the American public, Pew Internet Life research showed that people were modifying their behavior, they were self-censoring, they were curtailing their own speech. You have perhaps arguably given up some of your own privacy in order that many of us have more, one would hope, in the future. What are your thoughts on that?
So there are a couple things that I want to pursue on that. If I could make a quick technical note to the people working the stage audio, I can hear myself quite loudly, which is making it hard to speak at length. But you mentioned that privacy is a penumbra right, of course referring to previous statements by the Supreme Court. But I would offer a slightly different formulation here. Drawing on the arguments made by a former Supreme Court Justice, Brandeis, who offered that privacy is really something different and altogether more valuable than what we expect in the common usage. When we talk about privacy today in the modern context, we're really asking the word to do too much work. Privacy means many different things to many different people. Privacy for many people is just settings on their Facebook page. And so they go, I don't really care, it's just Facebook. But privacy is so much more. Brandeis said privacy is the right to enjoy the products of our own intellect. I would go further. I would say privacy is the fountainhead of all other rights. Privacy is the right to the self. Privacy is the right, as we have in the Constitution, to freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom from unreasonable search and seizure without probable cause. Privacy is the right to a free mind. Now, how can I say that, right? That seems sort of abstract, but when you think about it, privacy is what allows us to determine what we believe without being influenced by others, without being subject to peer pressure, without our ideas being prejudged before they're fully formed. Freedom of speech has no meaning if you don't have the space, the time, the freedom to determine what it is that you want to say. Freedom of religion has no value if you cannot independently determine what it is that you believe in. Otherwise, you're being influenced by what's popular or what you inherited. Now, when we go further from this, we realize that this is actually inherently understood by generations of speakers, generations of thinkers, going down all the way to something Mr. Chomsky might understand quite well, which are the underpinnings of our language. It's called private property for a reason. Without privacy, you can't have anything for yourself. You exist as a collective. You exist in a state of reaction to your environment at all times. You are a part of a larger being, but at no time are you permitted to have a space that is only just for you. And when I sort of follow this, and I think about this in my own terms, particularly when we're confronted with the arguments of sort of apologists for the national security state, and the argument that was first proposed by the Nazis against privacy, which was if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. I would say that arguing that you don't care about privacy because you have nothing to hide is like saying that you don't care about free speech because you have nothing to say. Rights exist and have value for more than just the individual in the current moment. Rights are both individual and collective. And when we think about the value of a free press, we're not all journalists, but we still derive value from them. Moreover, rights are not really intended. Rights are not really designed for use by the elites, the people who are leading our debates, because these are the people who are least threatened with the abrogation of their rights. The system exists to serve and protect these people. Rights are almost always needed on a regular, continuing basis by those who are vulnerable, by those who are not protected by the system, by those who are not protected by their communities, by the people who are different, by the people who are ahead of everyone else, who are proposing a new idea, or people who are simply minorities, don't have access to the same resources, don't have access to the same ability to compete. And to say fundamentally that you don't care about a right, even if it is truly of no value to you, because you're not using it in this current moment and you don't expect to use it in the future, is probably the most antisocial thing I can imagine.
For someone who's worked in privacy pretty much my whole career, I can't tell you the joy that I'm experiencing right now just hearing these comments. It's just a little too much fun. A question from our Two Shoes app. You all clearly care about privacy, and all of you watching at home care about privacy, and these gentlemen are contributing incredible amounts to this debate and the thought leadership. But do people in general care? Is there a generational shift? Is there a difference? Are people's experience of social media and their willingness, and let me just say, I don't necessarily agree with all of these questions. I am reading from a piece of paper, just so you know. Do people's activities online and being willing to give so much information freely show that people are less concerned about their digital selves than perhaps we all might want them to be? Let's start with Ed again.
So I'll try to take this quickly, because since I just rambled for some time here, I would argue it depends on the individual, because ultimately privacy, your feelings, your beliefs are always individual in nature. You can try to extrapolate from this, you can try to do some polling based on the groups, but to say that it doesn't have value even to the majority isn't really that material, even if it is the case. Again, rights don't exist for the majority. Rights exist to protect the minority against the majority. But even in this context, right, even if we put that aside, I would argue that many people do care about privacy, and they're beginning to care about it more than they have before, because they didn't realize it was threatened. They didn't realize they were being watched. As you saw, as you said previously, we've seen polling that indicates people are getting more protective of their privacy now. They're being more careful. They're concerned about the monitoring that's occurring. And when we think about why this is, generally there's a question here that I would actually be really interested in the ideas of the other speakers on the stage, is that there's this traditional idea that we inherited that some human interactions leave no trace. They occur without records. They are ephemeral in nature. It's an experience shared between you and your spouse, you and your pastor, or as they used to say, sort of in the privacy of your own home, the things that happen within those four walls are between you and your God, if you believe in them. Now, the NSA and other intelligence services around the world thought, well, that's really quite a shame, because imagine if we could hear everything. Imagine if we could hear what was happening within the four walls of your home. There would be tremendous investigative value in this. Now, they're not wrong. And the problem here is not necessarily that surveillance can occur at all. It's that it happens indiscriminately. It's that it happens to all of us, all of the time. And we're populating sort of buckets with the activities, the records of everyone, because they're out there. They're free. As long as you can access the telecommunications service providers, you can pull them right off the wire, what the government calls metadata, which the public would understand much better by its actual meaning, which are private activity records. Who you call, where you go, the things you've done, the purchases you've engaged with, the diary of activities of your life with every entry of what you've done, but not necessarily the details of how that you did it. Now, we take that back to this idea that there were private spaces before that no one could intrude upon by virtue of the fact that no records were left behind. If you wanted to know what someone did within their home, you had to ask them, and you had to hope they were willing to cooperate. Again, these were things that really, unless there's a God out there, there was no witness with the parties involved. But what we've seen is the advances of technology have allowed these state security agencies to go, well, why don't we build God from a machine? Why don't we create that form of omniscience through technology and create records on everyone just in case at some point we want to go back and look and see what they did? Now, this is a fairly extraordinary and unprecedented thing. Now, it is possible that the majority of the population would argue that this is a good thing, that we want our governments to be powerful, to be capable, to be omniscient, because then they could thwart additional crimes. But if that is to occur, at the very least, this is a decision that I believe the public should be involved in. We have a right to know, and we have a right to discuss it. This is not a decision that can ever be made for us by a few officials behind closed doors. And unfortunately, that is increasingly what we see happening.
No, I could just address that. You know, on the question of whether people care about privacy, I remember really vividly when Ed and I were in Hong Kong before we started reporting these stories. We spent a lot of time talking about what the likely outcome of the reporting would be. And we really had no idea what it would be. And I remember, because it struck me so much, Ed at one point saying, you know, I don't have any fears about what's about to happen in terms of what gets done to me, about going to prison. And it was clear that he meant that. And he said, the only fear that I really have is that we do this reporting and we unveil this to the world and people just sort of shrug and say, well, I assume the government was doing that, or I don't really care that they were doing that. And that it would be a 1 or 2 day story and then people would forget about it and go about their lives. And of course, that's exactly what did not happen. It became this enormous, incredibly consuming worldwide story, not just in the United States, but in dozens of countries on multiple continents around the world, precisely because people were so angry and offended at the intrusion into their privacy, including people who might have said in the past, I don't really care. And there's all kinds of evidence that shows just how concerned they are, from the massive increase in the number of people around the world who are now using encryption to protect the privacy of their communications, to the number of people who put pressure on the US government and both parties to enact legislation limiting these programs. But maybe the best evidence of all about how much people care about privacy is the behavioral change in Silicon Valley companies, the biggest ones, Yahoo and Facebook and Apple and Google and Microsoft. When I first read the archive that Ed gave me, one of the things that struck me the most was what full-scale collaborators these companies were in the surveillance state that the NSA had created. They were not only complying, there's a helpful chart from Ed that has just magically popped up, all the companies that were part of the prison program and when they joined. And it includes essentially every leading company in Silicon Valley. And they not only cooperated to the extent the law required, but even way beyond that. There were documents about how Microsoft would meet with the NSA to help them build backdoors into Skype at the same time that they were promising the public that Skype was impenetrable. And the reason they were such full-scale collaborators is because they were doing it completely in the dark and no one knew they were doing it, and therefore there was no cost. Once we were able to shine a light on what these companies were doing and the full-scale partnership they had created with the government, all of that changed completely. And it didn't change because these companies decided suddenly that they care about your privacy. They still don't care about your privacy. But what changed is their fear that if they were perceived as being collaborators with the NSA, that they would lose the current generation or the next generation of internet users to social media companies in Korea or Brazil or Germany who would be able to say, don't give your data to Facebook and Apple because they'll give it to the NSA, give it to us instead. And so whatever you want to say about these companies, one thing they know is their own self-interest and the pressures of their customer base. And they knew that it was really imperative that they demonstrate to the public that they actually are willing to safeguard people's privacy, even if it means standing up to the FBI, refusing, even in a case like San Bernardino, to build a backdoor into iPhones, even if it meant enduring being called aiders and abettors of ISIS or having blood on their hands as a result of helping terrorists hide their communication. All the things these companies have endured and are enduring, not because they're suddenly privacy activists, but because they know that tens of millions of people around the world care deeply about their privacy and won't use these companies if they think their privacy is going to be compromised. That is the best evidence of all to answer the question, do people care about their privacy?
And hold that thought, because we're going to get to encryption and Apple and FBI in just a minute. And I've said over and over again that the post-Snowden era really is one in which we have crystallized the issue at the digital age, which is the blurring of the lines between data held by corporate actors and data held by the federal government, and our unknowing prior to several years ago. But I do want to get back to Noam Chomsky with the question, do people care? You have seen more generations than the other two speakers. Is there an attitudinal shift? Is there an age, gender, national origin difference? And a special question from Michelle Dennedy, my good friend and a privacy leader at Cisco currently, to Professor Chomsky. In your work on learning and persona, how do you perceive this new curated and often very public digital self that people are creating online? What does that mean in the evolution of self?
Well, with regard to the personal need to privacy, my own feeling is that the answer was given centuries ago by Blaise Pascal in his Pensées, his thoughts. He observed briefly that the root of man's misfortunes is the lack of a room in which you can sit quietly and undisturbed. And if he had thought about surveillance, he would have said, without surveillance. And I think that's probably universal. It's, of course, a metaphor, but what it means, I think, is correct. I really can't comment on the impact of social media. I'm too antediluvian for that. I don't use them. I don't follow them. I don't like them. My grandchildren use them. Okay, but what effect that's had? I suspect that my general feeling is that it's kind of unhealthy. I think it leads to a sense of intimacy that is fraudulent, very superficial interactions among people, which So, I mean, I don't say this on the basis of any deep inquiry or study, but to take a real case, if a teenage kid, take a real case, is having a test tomorrow and says, gee, I had 200 friends who told me, I hope you do well, so look how much of a social life I have. I think there's something deeply wrong about that. Actually, it reminds me of a friend long before the days of the internet, when I was 10 years old. I had a friend who was kind of a laughing stock among the small group of friends because he had a notebook in which he listed all of his friends. And he once told us proudly he had 100 friends, which means he had no friends.
That's just sad. And so true, as we all go count our Facebook friend lists. So many threads we can pull out of this conversation, but so much of what Ed and Glenn have talked about is the concept of state secrets. And in the course of the work both of you have done, you have revealed state secrets, much to the consternation of many in the country. Tell us about that narrative. Was it necessary? Should there be state secrets at all? And for Noam, when you two are done, so keep it brief, are state secrets a form of regulation as posited by Daniel Patrick Moynihan many years ago? Glenn.
You know, one of the points of the reporting that we've done is the emphasis a lot has been on the subversion of privacy presented by the surveillance state. And I remember the first time I looked through the archive, it wasn't the subversion of privacy that most struck me, although that was certainly severe and substantial. What most struck me and kind of shocked me and horrified me was the subversion of democracy that these documents reveal. And I say that because the internet is undoubtedly one of the most important human innovations of the last several centuries. As Professor Chomsky was saying earlier, it could be this unprecedented tool of liberalization and democratization, or it can actually be an unprecedented tool of coercion and control. And what the US government did, as these documents revealed, was made an extraordinarily consequential decision about how this human innovation was going to be used and exploited. And it made this incredibly consequential choice completely in the dark, without any whiff on the part of the public that is supposedly a part of a democracy, that this was being done. So, as Ed was saying earlier, of course, everybody, or virtually everybody, thinks there are certain things you want the government to keep secret. You don't want them publicizing who the target of investigations are. You don't want them publicizing who they think are terrorists, because that can ruin people's reputation. It can jeopardize due process. But when you're talking about the most consequential choices that the government can make, if they make that with no transparency and no knowledge on the part of the citizenry, you know, we can go to the ballot box every 2 or 4 years and check a box next to a candidate or a party, but what we have is a purely illusory democracy. And so when I saw, you know, these documents, the fact that they were stamped top secret didn't make me hesitate about publishing them. It made me want to rush as fast as possible and publish them as quickly as I could, because it was just so offensive that the government and the people within it thought they had the right to make these choices and build a wall of secrecy around what they were doing.
If I could follow on that, just from a point of answering the direct criticism, which is, did this put people at risk, right? Because we do have a lot of very sort of national security officials, but increasingly a smaller and smaller percentage of the public believes anyone actually came to harm as a result. Now, why is that? In 2013, you could credibly make the argument that, oh, these reporters are going to have blood on their hands, these newspapers are going to get people killed, because of what's published, because we didn't know. And it seemed scary at the time. Nobody knew what the next story was. Nobody knew how the Washington Post, the Guardian, or Der Spiegel were going to handle the reporting. But now we're in 2016, and the Director of National Intelligence, the Director of the CIA, the NSA, the DIA have all been called in front of Congress multiple times and basically begged on both knees by many different committees to give them a single name of a person who died as a result of this reporting, and it's never happened. Now, how did that come to be? And that's because of intentional decisions that myself and the journalists made in the process of reporting out this material. I made individual determinations about what documents I believed would be in the public interest to know, what showed violations of law, of constitutionality, and of simple morality in many cases, and other things that were needed simply for context, for journalists to be able to understand what the real value of these programs were, where they actually worked, where they functioned correctly, properly, and where they didn't. But before the journalists received any material, I made them a promise to go to the government in advance of publishing any story and give the government a rough idea, basically a general idea of the documents they're reporting on, the story, the direction, the details of what's being revealed, so that the government could make an argument of whether or not there's something in these stories that would cause harm to an individual, that would cause harm to national security in a real and meaningful way that could get somebody killed. And in every case, the journalists have done that. In every case, the government has had a chance to make that argument. And increasingly, this is quite interesting. In the very first year of reporting, the government in every case availed itself of this and argued, hey, take a look at this, maybe you don't understand. Although I understand in very few cases was the reporting actually altered as a result, because the government was largely engaged in hand-waving. But as the years have gone on, and the government has become more familiar with the reporting and the reporters, they've argued that there might be some harm caused as a result on a less and less frequent basis. In many cases, they don't even return calls for requests for comment anymore, because they are more concerned about looking bad in the newspaper than they are that these reporters are actually going to get something wrong and get something killed. So high is the standard of care taken into the reporting of these stories. And that is something that, for me, gives me a high level of confidence that, in the long span of history, when we look back on this, we will see that the public interest was served in all cases, and any real risks were mitigated to the best of our capability. Now, that is something that I think everybody should aspire for, but it doesn't mean it's required. There are other models of journalism, for example, famously the WikiLeaks model of journalism, that regardless of whose decision it was to put these cables in an unredacted form online, it's argued by some that this was the decision of WikiLeaks. It's argued by others that this was the mistake of journalists who accidentally published the password that would allow anybody to see this material. But when we look back in time, this was 250,000 diplomatic cables that were all classified at the secret level or below. Now, the standards of classification, legal standard in the United States, is confidential. The lowest level is will cause serious harm to the national security of the United States if a single document is published. Secret is much higher. It says grave damage will occur as the result of the publication of a single document or detail from the document. Top secret is exceptionally grave harm. And when they say grave, they mean graves in the ground, right? This is a very serious matter. But despite the fact that 250,000 documents were published from the State Department, I believe 750,000 documents of actual military operational records were published. At the trial of the individual that was accused and convicted on the basis of providing this material to journalists, Chelsea Manning, the government did not argue that a single person died as a result. Now, if 1 million classified documents can be published completely unredacted and no one dies, is this making an argument that we're at existential risk if a single document gets out and it's the end of the republic? Or is it actually revealing that we are classifying so many things by virtue of processes, by virtue of simply the typical government operation, and as Glenn pointed out, the avoidance of scandal, that we have lost sight of what a real life-threatening secret truly is?
So just a follow-up point of clarification and then a question. You said top secret. Ed, you said secret. Were you looking at the same documents, or did I hear that wrong?
You know, when he said secret, he was talking about the WikiLeaks documents that were released. Many of the documents that we released as part of the Snowden reporting were top secret, although just quickly to follow up on one thing Ed said, just to give you a sense for how much these secrecy powers are abused, there are literally documents in what he provided that are things like the vacation schedules of various employees, rules for their lunchroom, how you make requests for time off, and at the top it will say top secret, which the standard is supposed to be grave harm to national security. And I think that's actually the bigger problem. The bigger threat is not that we might release a document inadvertently that shouldn't have been released because it's top secret. The much bigger threat is that your government, almost reflexively at this point, makes it a felony to disclose anything that they're doing, no matter how routine and no matter how standard.
So Noam, do you agree?
If I could just follow up with a very brief point. There is one central point that I think we all need to bear in mind when we face this criticism as a public, right? It doesn't really matter whether I'm a saint. It doesn't really matter whether I'm a devil. I am immaterial to the actual facts of the conversation and what democracy is going to have to deal with the day after tomorrow. Don't worry about the leaker, right? Worry about the actual documentation, the actual information. And on the inverse, the other side, when we see these officials that are arguing against it, they're saying, oh, it's risky, oh, it's damaging, but they don't show any evidence of the fact that anyone's come to harm as a result. Think about what they're doing. And this is really the core of the controversy to which we all must be vigilant and be careful about and to push back against when we see it happening. What they're doing when they argue that the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Guardian or any other newspaper shouldn't be publishing stories about the secret activities of the government, is they're trying to change the subject. They're trying to make us have a conversation about the theoretical risks of a free press that is enshrined in our First Amendment, rather than the concrete harms of the actual details of their operations that are being published.
I'd like to look at this from a slightly different point of view. I mentioned before that we're lucky in the United States that it's a relatively open society with regard to secret documents. Nowhere near enough, but by comparative standards. So we have just a mine of documents that have been declassified, either by the government or by exposure, like Dan Ellsberg and others. And when you look through these documents, anybody who's worked through them, I've spent a lot of time on them, and I'd urge you to look at them. What you find is that almost nothing is concerned with security of the population. And it's the opposite that's the case. Most of the documents are trying to keep what the government is doing secret from the population, which is the domestic population is the primary enemy. They are not supposed to know what we're doing, therefore it has to be secret. And when you look closely, you find this everywhere. So just to take one case in point that's on the front pages now, President Obama is in Cuba, has been in Cuba. And as all of you should know, the United States has almost immediately after Cuba achieved its freedom for the first time, 1959. Within months, the United States was attacking Cuba. Kennedy launched a very serious terrorist war, murderous, brutal terrorist war. There's been economic warfare, harsh economic warfare. What's it for? Well, the secret documents tell us. Now that they've been released, we know what it was for. We find that it was because, I'll quote, because of Castro's successful defiance of U.S. policies going back to the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, which asserted, couldn't yet implement, but it asserted the U.S. right to dominate the hemisphere. And Cuba was carrying out successful defiance of this doctrine. That can't be accepted. Goes on. The problem of the Castro idea is that it encourages people in Latin America to take matters into their own hands, an idea which will have considerable resonance in other countries aside from Cuba because of the historical circumstances, and we can't tolerate that. And it goes on like that. Now, the government does not want you to know that that's why we're carrying out terrorist wars and economic warfare. It wants another story. And you find this everywhere you look. You can find some things that are genuine national security, but they're extremely rare. Overwhelmingly, it's security of the state from the population, which it regards with some justice as its a primary enemy.
Well, you've all painted a very dark picture.
I should point out that this isn't just a relic of history either. You know, this isn't something that stopped back in the 1960s, although that really was when we saw the heyday. We have seen, and this was reported in The Guardian, I think, Glenn, you may have had some hand in this, that even in the modern documents, the same thing is repeated. The GCHQ, the British version of the NSA, which works on the basis of NSA technology, NSA even helps fund them, their documents quite bluntly stated in a classified document that could not be released to the public, it was an above top secret level document, said that what they were really concerned about if these programs became public was not the loss of lives, was not that attacks would succeed, was not that anything would slip through and we would be in danger, but rather, their words, quote, a damaging public debate on the scale of its activities would lead to legal challenges against the constitutionality of these mass surveillance programs. And we saw in this case, they were absolutely right to be afraid of that because we did challenge it in court and we won.
So I just want to note that Ed has a several-second lag time. He's not jumping in and being rude. He just doesn't hear the speakers, so please forgive that. And we'll try to forgive you too, Ed. I'll get back to you later. You've all painted a very bleak picture and a very dark picture of our government and other governments' motives, and I will try to refrain from my opinion of various international governments around the world and their issues of privacy and free expression, but we can't deny that this week's headlines are very tragic. And Ed, if your litmus test is people dying, well, people died in Brussels this week, and there are many who are justifiably and very really afraid for their own personal safety, not only in this country, but around the world. So what do we say to citizens, not only here at home in the United States, but in countries that have experienced terrorism repeatedly, about how we can combat terrorism, how we can live in a free and open society, both for our own physical safety and also our civil liberties? Glenn, you look like you want to say something. No, Ed, you have to wait.
Oh, sorry. I apologize.
That's okay.
Well, let me say that there are plenty of people who live constantly under the threat of terrorism. If you want to find them, go to Yemen or North Waziristan, where people don't have to be told about terrorism. They are constantly in fear that 5 minutes from now, the guy across the street is going to be blown away along with anybody else who happens to be around. That's massive global terrorism. And it has repercussions. And we're seeing some of the repercussions. What happened in Brussels was a monstrous terrorist act, but it's worth looking at the explanation that was given for it. ISIS took credit for it and issued a statement which basically said, as long as you keep bombing us, we're going to respond by attacking you. There's something to that. There's a real problem, but the answer, and we can we have to make a decision as to how to deal with it. One decision we can make is to follow the playbook that Al-Qaeda and ISIS have presented and want us to follow. Namely, and they're very explicit about it, destroy your own societies, destroy your own freedom and liberty, and get into a war with the Muslim world. That's their playbook. We can accept that if we like. We've been doing it for 15 years. If you go back 15 years to the launching of the so-called war on terror, terrorism, what we call terrorism, was located in a tiny area of tribal areas of what we call Afghanistan and Pakistan. Where is it now? All over the world. Every time you hit it with a sledgehammer, it expands. The invasion of Iraq, for example. One of the effects was that in the year following it, terrorism increased by a factor of 7. Intelligence agencies had predicted that it would lead to more terror, but it was way beyond. And that continues. There's another possibility, and that is to try to get to the roots and the causes of it and try to deal with them. It's not dramatic and exciting, but it would work. And there's plenty of research that tells us why people turn to terrorism. Take Brussels or Paris. The terrorist acts are carried out by people who lived and grew up there in slums, miserable suburbs, young people who lived with humiliation, degradation, no hope, some from countries in North Africa where they'd been subjected to brutal European atrocities for centuries. Young people who wanted something in their lives. They wanted some dignity, some hope, some excitement, something to look forward to. They were not going to find it in their own societies. So most of them had very little background in Islam. They picked up Islam. This gave them a cause, okay? We can increase that by following the ISIS playbook, or you could look at the causes for it and try to deal with them. Take a look at the British in Northern Ireland. Terrorism in England was pretty serious for a long time, much more than it is now. Fortunately, they didn't react by carpet bombing Northern Ireland, following Ted Cruz's proposal. They finally, after a long period of doing the wrong thing, reacting with violence, they began to consider the reasons and the causes and to deal with them. And didn't turn into a paradise, but it's a big difference. I was in Belfast in 1993, and it was a war zone, literally. I was there 15 years later. It was, you could see tensions, but it was a pretty normal city. And some of the people who had been hitmen for the IRA were now part of the negotiating teams. That's the way you deal with it if you want to end the terrorism. If you want to follow the playbook outlined by Osama bin Laden and his successors, then hit it with a sledgehammer.
So, I also want to address that root cause issue in a minute, because it's really at the crux of everything we're talking about here, because even people inclined to agree with a lot of what we're saying about the value of privacy ultimately run into that brick wall called terrorism, which is really just fear-mongering. You elevate people's fear enough, and they're eager to run into the arms of authority. This is human nature that has existed for as long as human beings have. But let me just quickly address a couple of specific points with relation to terrorism and surveillance. First of all, the key difference is between targeted surveillance and mass surveillance. Nobody disagrees that targeted surveillance is legitimate. The idea that you have reason to believe that certain individuals are plotting violent acts against civilians and therefore you monitor their communications. If that's what the US government had been doing, you would never have known the name Edward Snowden. There would never have been a leak. That's exactly what they're not doing. What they're doing instead is mass surveillance. They've constructed the largest system of suspicionless surveillance ever created in human history, where they're targeting not specific individuals who are likely involved in terrorism, but hundreds of millions of people, entire populations, to very invasive scrutiny. One of the things that struck me when I read through the documents was how few of them have anything to do with terrorism. As Professor Chomsky was saying earlier, you read through documents and you're shocked by how little of it has to do with national security. There's tons of it that have to do with spying on economic targets, on oil companies, on economic conferences where countries negotiate trade agreements, spying for diplomatic advantage, spying on entire populations, including our own. Very little of this apparatus has been devoted to actual terrorism. And then the final specific point I want to make about that is that we always talk about, and your question suggested this, that there's a trade-off between security and privacy. So that if you want more security, you have to give up more privacy and let the government spy more, and vice versa. This is a really false dichotomy. And huge numbers of experts have said that when you allow the government to collect billions of telephone calls and emails every day, as the US government is doing, billions every day, that it is virtually impossible for them to find who's going to detonate a bomb at the Boston Marathon, or who is planning on blowing up a jetliner over Detroit, or detonating a bomb in the subway and airport of Brussels, or attacking a newspaper in Paris, because they're collecting so much information that they can't possibly find what they claim they're looking for. And if I know that, and if all these experts are saying that, they know that as well, which ought to really provoke the question, is it really the case that they're just so incompetent that they don't get this basic fact that if they collect everything, they won't know what they have? Or is there some other purpose to this spying system beyond the stated purpose of finding terror plots? And I think that ultimately is the key question. And, I just want to make one point about terrorism itself, and Professor Chomsky made all the key points, but what's really remarkable to me is I've had the misfortune, because I was traveling this week throughout the U.S., of being subjected to what I typically try really hard to avoid, which is watching cable news. And what's amazing is, they had like wall-to-wall coverage of every minute aspect of this terrorist attack in Brussels, and they had like all their famous TV correspondents in their really chic overcoats being deployed to Brussels, walking around like all investigative and whatever. All those actors who play the role of journalists on TV, they're all in Brussels. And, for everything that they talked about, the one question that literally was never asked is, what was the motive in why terrorists decided to sacrifice their own lives and kill people in Belgium? Like, why would they do that? It was just assumed these are savages and barbaric monsters with this primitive, inscrutable religion. I've lived in Brazil for the last 10 years. Brazil is a non-Muslim country, overwhelmingly Catholic and evangelical. It's also a free and open and democratic society. There's never any talk about Muslims targeting Brazil. The same is true in Japan or Korea or Argentina or Chile or dozens of democratic non-Muslim countries around the world. Why is that? Is it that the terrorists just put the names of all the countries into a paper bag and like randomly pull the ones out and that they're going to attack? Or is there something that is true about the governments and policies of the countries they attack that is causing them to become targets? And there's tons of evidence, as Professor Chomsky said, but just go to Google and Google 2004 Rumsfeld report on terrorism. Because Donald Rumsfeld in 2004 asked this question. He said, why are there so many people who hate the United States so much that they're willing to give up their own lives to attack and kill Americans? And the answer that Donald Rumsfeld's commission said was, it said, you know what, these people, they don't hate us for our freedoms, and they don't hate us because they're involved in a religious war or because they have this religion that hypnotizes them into committing violence. They hate us because of our policies. Overwhelming support for Israel, occupying and bombing their countries, killing their children, propping up their dictators. And so as Professor Chomsky said, we can continue to engage in those policies that our own government says in secret causes terrorism, or if we're really serious about stopping it, we don't need to spend tens of billions of dollars and tell the government to spy on us. We can ask ourselves, what is it that we can be doing differently that lessens that desire and dilutes and weakens that infrastructure?
If I can just add a word, that report was quite interesting, and particularly interesting was that it was a repeat of a National Security Council document from 1958, when that's one of the advantages of living in a free society where you can get declassified documents. President Eisenhower in 1958 asked his staff, why is there a campaign of hatred against us in the Arab world, not from the governments, but from the populations? And there happened to be a National Security Council study that came out that year which gave the answer. It said there is a perception in the Arab world that the United States supports brutal and dictatorial regimes and blocks democracy and development, and that we do it because we want to make sure we can control their resources and their policies. And then it said these perceptions are more or less accurate, but we should continue doing it because that's in our interests. So the Rumsfeld report is repeating what we should know and what the victims do know. They don't have to read secret documents to find out.
Ed, we're going to let you jump in.
If I could just chime in on one point here as somebody who actually worked with these programs. One of them was that, we get all of this talk on the news about the fear of terrorism, the fact that attacks do happen, but very rarely is any actual context provided. The troubles in Ireland, as we so euphemistically called them, were actually far more serious and claimed far more Western lives than Al-Qaeda ever has. And this is something that's not really provided. If you look at the actual statistics of quality of life, of the risk of dying in a terrorist attack, and so on and so forth in Western Europe, we're safer now than we were in decades prior, despite the fact that you constantly see sort of national security officials and pundits, people who profit off of the industry of terrorism analysis, arguing that sort of the lights are flashing red, this is more dangerous than it's ever been, they've never seen anything like this before. Really, guys, we lived through the Cold War, the threat of nuclear annihilation. You're worried about a few terrorists who claim fewer lives than bathtub falls or our own police officers every year? It's not that terrorism is not real. It is a serious crime. It is dangerous. But we should treat it as a crime. We should investigate it. We should apply resources there. And we should also hold ourselves to account when our programs and policies are not working. Now, this is a key point that Glenn raised, which is that the public justification for these programs, which is terrorism, may not line up with the actual value produced by these programs. Now, in the wake of 2013, the NSA revelations, the president said initially he thought that we had drawn the right balance on these programs. Nobody's listening to your phone calls and so on and so forth. Don't worry about it, nothing to see here. But by January 2014, he gave a speech on the basis of his own independent panels that he appointed that were all sort of packed with his friends, including such liberal reformists as the former deputy director of the CIA, who found that these mass surveillance programs had never thwarted a single terrorist attack in the United States. Moreover, they had not made a, quote their words, concrete difference in a single terrorism investigation that could not have been gotten through alternative investigative means. Now, in all of the talk of Brussels, there's a story that just recently broke, which I'm not sure has gotten the same play as the others, which is that the attack was preventable. And it was preventable through traditional means, not mass surveillance. An allied intelligence service, in this case in Turkey, warned Belgium that this individual was a criminal, that they were involved in terrorist activities, and that individual turned out to be one of the suicide bombers. Another one of them had been wanted since December in relation with the terrorist attacks. And this is not something that exists just in Europe. It's not the failures of an underfunded Belgian anti-terrorist organization. In the United States, we had the same thing in the Boston Marathon bombings. We were explicitly warned by foreign intelligence services that one of the brothers who was involved in the bombings would be engaged in that kind of activity. And yet, we did nothing to stop it. Now, this is the challenge. The question is, why? Why didn't we stop it? And the reality here is our resources are misallocated. When you collect it all, as the NSA's aspiration here is to watch everybody everywhere all the time just in case, when you collect everything, you understand nothing. You don't have the focus, you don't have the context, you don't have specialists who are focused on a few carefully selected targets. You're blinded by the noise. I worked at that desk. I personally used the tools of mass surveillance, such as X-keyscore, which you can think of as sort of Google for spies. It's what gave me the ability to look up your email or anybody else's browsing activity on Amazon.com and so on and so forth, without a court order or anything else. Now, that was the technical capability. Of course, you're not supposed to do this, but all you have to do is enter the email address, and no one's ever going to know about it. And then we go, all right, well, these guys aren't stupid. If they created a system of mass surveillance, they're not doing it for nothing. If it doesn't work against terrorism, it must work for something, right? So what is that what? When we look at the actual use of intelligence agencies that were using this, we've found post-2013, courts have found that they were using it to spy on NGOs, human rights organizations such as Amnesty. They were capturing the emails of journalists. These programs were going beyond things that were specifically focused on terrorism, and they were capturing webcam images off of things like Yahoo video chats. For everyone without any individualized suspicion of criminality. That could be the laptop in your bedroom. And these were held despite the fact that they knew they had a lot of evidence of sexual activities and other very intensely private activities sitting in a government database that analysts were trawling through, and they did nothing about it. Now, these kind of issues extended, and we saw the NSA, sort of, our American intelligence service, using these capabilities to develop programs that were monitoring the pornography viewing habits of radicals whose politics the government disapproved of. Now, it's important to note here that in the NSA's own documents about this, their own reports, they say these individuals are not known to be associated with violence or associated with terrorism. They were simply what the government considered to be radicalizers. Now, there can be arguments made about whether we should have the government policing sort of radical politics and so on and so forth, but that is something that traditionally one would hope would be considered inherently un-American. And if that was going to change, if we were going to start being the political police for the world, that's something that should be publicly debated and something that we should have a say in.
So bringing the terrorism and national security conversation back to each of us individually and locally, obviously a critical case working its way through the courts right now is Apple FBI. I'm incredibly proud, by the way, of the CDT amicus brief, and I'll just give away the punchline that we are firmly on the all pro-encryption side of that case. I want to ask the panel what their thoughts are and what this case signals for individual liberties and individual privacy in the truly always-on digital world. But to crystallize this question from the CDT chief technologist Joe Lorenzo Hall, who writes, "We have never had so much of our environment networked and computerized, and we have never had the ability for average citizens to hold truly hard secrets, secrets that frustrate even the most powerful government access through our increasingly secure mobile devices. Do societies, and really civilization in general, have to come to terms with the ability for common people to hold hard secrets?"
So I'll start just with a couple observations about what's at stake in that FBI Apple conflict. Before I was a journalist, I was a lawyer, as you referenced earlier, and I used to defend a lot of free speech cases. And the tactic of the government whenever they want to erode free speech is to pick the most unsympathetic possible person to abridge their free speech, that the precedent is created, that they have the power to abridge free speech, and then they can start making their way outward to more sympathetic cases, but by then it's too late because the person they began with you hated so much that you allowed them to do it. And that's why free speech defenders like the ACLU find themselves defending the Ku Klux Klan or neo-Nazis or Fred Phelps, the most hated people in society, because they're the ones who are most vulnerable to having their rights abridged in a way that will let your rights be abridged after. That's exactly what the FBI did in this case, was they found the least sympathetic case possible. Who would ever argue that the FBI should be blocked from accessing the telephone of the person who committed the San Bernardino murders? Nobody would ever argue that. And yet what the FBI was doing in this case was pure deceit. They wanted to create a precedent whereby Apple and other companies were forced into essentially involuntary labor on behalf of the government, where they would be forced to build, using their own engineers, backdoors that would let the FBI access not just this iPhone, but all iPhones. That would also then be a backdoor that a lot of other people could use. And the broader philosophical question that really was raised by this is, which is what the question suggested, which is, should there ever be a way that citizens can communicate in a way that the government just physically cannot access? That really is what the government is attempting to do. Their motto, sort of like football teams have mottos or car rental agencies have motto, the NSA has a motto, and their motto, as Ed said earlier, is collect it all. Not collect a lot of it, and not collect all the terrorist communication. They want to collect it all, which is another way of saying they want to be able to collect and store all communications by and between human beings on this planet, which is another way of saying eliminating privacy in the digital age. And that's what's at stake in Apple and FBI. And the one thing that always fascinates me is we all read 1984 in high school, and it's sort of become almost a cliche to bring it up in privacy debates. And unfortunately for me, high school was a really long time ago, which is when I read 1984, and I had actually misremembered it. I remember the warning of Orwell being that if you live in a society where you're always being watched, that's when you lose freedom. And so you raise 1984 and people would say, no, our society is different. We're not all being watched. We're not all having all our emails and read and telephone calls listened to. But I actually went back and read 1984 when I started doing this work, and the world that Orwell was warning of was not one in which we were all being watched. It was a world in which we could be watched at any moment. And Winston Smith, the narrator, said that this monitor that was in your home, you never knew if it was on. You never knew if anybody was actually ever watching you at all. What you knew is that you could be watched at any moment, and therefore you had to act as though you were being watched, which meant people who know they could be watched act obediently and compliantly and submissively and without dissent. That is the precedent the government is trying to create in this FBI Apple case, is that there can never be a moment when you are able to communicate beyond the surveillance arm of the United States government.
Happy to endorse those remarks.
Ed, what are your thoughts?
Okay. When we think about this, again, I think the core issue here is, who's privacy really for? Privacy is not for the powerful when we think about who should hold secrets, should the public be permitted to hold secrets, nor is it new. Again, the ephemerality of human communications is actually the status quo. That's the way it always was in the history of our species. Think about it. If you were a police officer and you were investigating a crime, would you rather have the technology and the state of play of human communications today available to you, or would you rather have it 200 years ago when telephonic wiretaps didn't exist, when there were no records of all of your travels, everywhere that your Easy Pass went on your car, every purchase that you had ever made as a result of your credit card? And critically, it's important to understand that in controversy at this case, is not actually who these individuals were calling, right? It's not who they were in contact with, because all of that information is metadata. Metadata does not simply exist on the telephone, because metadata are the actual activity records. The way the phone system works, right, is you've got a phone here for you, and you've got a phone for the distant end, the person that you're talking to. They don't communicate by magic. The signal has to travel over service providers' lines who are not owned by the customer. And records of all of these activities are being created by the businesses for legitimate purposes, just for the purpose of keeping track of their billing and monitoring, metering, and so on and so forth for quality of service levels, and to make sure you get charged for making a call. Now, these records have already been turned over to the FBI. They've had them since only days after the investigation. So they already know that these phones weren't in contact with foreign terrorists and so on and so forth, because if they were, it happened by magic. And if we're dealing with terrorists who are also wizards, we have larger problems. But the central issue that I really come back to here in the context of what the questioner was asking of, do we deserve privacy, right? Is the world ready for the public to have privacy? Well, again, it's embedded in our language. We're called private citizens and public officials because the government is supposed to know in almost every case very little about us, about the ordinary people, whereas we are supposed to know nearly everything about their activities. Yet because of the growth of state secrets, the growth of classification in many different ways, we know less and less about the government than we ever have before. And we see this becoming a culture in government. We see very senior officials in government creating sort of their own email servers and things like that to hide their communications from public records requests, which Professor Chomsky said are sort of the antidote to this. Well, okay, they can have whatever communications they want, as long as we can file Freedom of Information Act requests, as long as they can get they can get requisitioned or declassified down the line. But what happens when a culture of unaccountability begins to blossom and take root within our government? And we know nothing about what they're doing. And if they are engaged in unlawful or inappropriate activity, we can never know because they created systems to hide it from us. At the same time that systems of global pervasive surveillance are being stood up, not just in the United States, but every other country in the world. And everything that we do is becoming transparent, while the activities of powerful members of society, privileged members of society, are becoming opaque.
So just to follow on to that, Ed, this case for so many of us who work in technology really focuses on the ability of one as an individual to use technology to shield and to protect. Do you want to comment, or could you comment for so many people who asked online, your thoughts about tools that individuals should or could be using, or what should we be aspiring to in our use of technology? And I welcome others to weigh in as well.
So this is a real challenging question to compress, because unfortunately it's still quite difficult. You can't be truly invisible online. There's no invisibility cloak. There's no magic wand that's going to protect you from everything. Particularly, even if you're using secure tools, if you don't understand how they function, you can make mistakes, or you can be leaving trails and so on and so forth. And this is one of the reasons that the FBI's jobs and the FBI's claims that they're going dark are so ridiculous. Even if you have an encrypted phone, even if you have sort of encrypted communications programs, those things like those metadata records, again, the private activity records, the details that are thrown off as pollution, just by the fact that a communication occurred. Even if they can't read the communication, they can see the fact that it happened. And if they see a US person or anybody else who's they're concerned about being involved in terrorism or something like that, calling the Al-Qaeda hotline in Pakistan, even if they can't tell what was said on it, they know that person's probably a person of interest. But just raw technology for those who are interested, who are motivated, you should be using Tor, the Tor project, or the Tor browser bundle, as is commonly downloaded by normal internet users, to hide and protect sort of the general activities that you're involved in online from corporate spies, right? From your internet service provider, from AT&T and Verizon and Comcast and whatnot. So they don't have records of your activities if they don't need them. Not just, this isn't just about the government. This is about having the privacy to type something in a Google prompt without having it follow you home. For communications on cell phones, sending text messages, just download an app called Signal. It's in the App Store for either Android or iOS. And this works on telephonic communications. Again, in this way, when you're sending text messages back and forth or sending pictures that could be intimate, they could be private, your cell phone company can't see them. And the NSA can't be swapping them around as they did with nude photos when I was working there. But in terms of, because there's a counterbalancing thing here where you go, well, if you have these tools, does this mean that terrorists will get away scot-free, that we won't know what's going on? That's not the case. Again, even in the case of perfect software-based encryption in theory, you have to understand the technical principle here, which is anytime you're enciphering information, right, you're scrambling it so that your adversaries can't see it, it means you can't see it either unless you've deciphered it, unless you've unlocked it at some point. Now, typically this is on the basis of a password or some type of derived key. But the way to kind of conceptualize this is that when you turn your phone off, when you put it on the counter, when you leave it behind or whatever, it's scrambled, it's white noise, but it's not any good to you either. It's just a brick sitting on the shelf. If you want to actually see your text messages, if you actually want to call someone, if you actually want to look at your photos or whatever, you have to be able to unlock the phone. And when you do this, this is a point of vulnerability that governments can and do exploit, as do criminal groups and other organizations, because they simply hack your device while it's hot, while it's live, while it's decrypted, and they steal the key that unlocks the device. Or more simply, this was the case of the Silk Road drug market. There was an individual, they were considering him sort of a criminal mastermind type, use encrypted communications and so on and so forth. So they went, oh gosh, we won't be able to get our evidence, which we need to convict this individual, even though they didn't even need it in this case. How do we do it? Well, if we can't break the encryption, are we totally out of luck, right? If Apple couldn't unlock this phone for the FBI, if they wouldn't unlock this phone for the FBI, does this mean the government has to throw its hands up and say, we're done, we have to close up shop, there's no more law enforcement investigations? Well, in the case of this person who was using encrypted communications, encrypted hard drives, and so on and so forth, in the Silk Road case, they created a very simple ploy. This individual was operating out of public libraries. So when they opened their laptop, decrypted their device, began engaging in sort of their alleged criminal schemes, two FBI agents in disguise as sort of a husband and wife pair standing to this individual's left created a gigantic scene. They acted like they were having some sort of spat. When the individual's head turned to the left, an FBI agent to his right simply picked up his laptop, which was now unencrypted, and took it away. The NSA gets around encryption every day of the week and twice on Sundays. I lived this. Encryption is an impediment, right? But the value to the public of securing your rights, not just in the United States, but other countries where you can't rely on your rights all the time, where you have local police agencies that could be investigating journalists. This provides a way of enforcing human rights through new means, which are reliable in an international space. And we should not sacrifice that simply for the desired efficiency of having access to information that a few years ago wouldn't have existed to begin with.
So our time is almost drawing to a close, but I have a couple more questions. And the first one is for Professor Chomsky. You have challenged the role of media as the guardian of the power structure, but given Glenn's meteoric rise as a journalist and now Ed's status as a Twitter star, although I follow Swift on security and Joe Lorenzo Hall for my cybersecurity needs, so I recommend both of them to you. Should we be rethinking the fourth estate, and is technology disrupting in a good way, or is it simply reinforcing traditional power structures?
We should be paying close attention to the way the media frame, choose, organize, analyze, present materials to us. Glenn mentioned 1984, another book that you read in high school, I suppose, it was Animal Farm. But I suspect that you did not read the introduction to Animal Farm.
You mean me personally just was negligent and skipped over it, or just people generally don't do that?
In school, in school. Later, yes, but not in school. The introduction to Animal Farm bears on this question. It was unpublished for unknown reasons, but it was later discovered 30 years later in Orwell's unpublished papers. In the introduction, he basically says, look, this book is, the introduction is addressed to the people of England. It's called Literary Censorship in England. And the thrust of it is, this book is a satire on the totalitarian enemy, but we people in England shouldn't feel too self-righteous about it, because in free England, unpopular ideas can be suppressed without the use of force. And then he goes into some examples, and he has really just a couple of sentences of explanation, which are to the point. He says, the reason is that the press is owned by wealthy men who have every interest in not wanting certain ideas to be expressed. And the other reason, which I think is more interesting, is a good education. When you have a good education, you've gone to the best schools, you went to Oxford and Cambridge, you have it instilled into you that there are certain things it just wouldn't do to say. And in fact, we can add wouldn't do to think. A framework of obedience is instilled into you, which shapes what the media present. And we see this every time you open a newspaper. I'm often asked to give talks on the media, and I never prepare. What I usually do is take that morning's newspaper and talk about it in any country, no matter where it is. So take, say, this morning, several examples. There's an interesting article in the New York Times on the prosecution of 7 Iranians for cyber attacks in the United States. And the report points out that this was probably in retaliation to massive cyber attacks by the United States against Iran. And it quotes Senator Schumer saying, well, this teaches us that not that we shouldn't be carrying out cyber war, but that we should be more careful about retaliation. Well, if there were, it wasn't instilled into you that you should obey the framework of official Washington, you could add to that report that the U.S. government regards cyber war as an act of war which justifies a military response, and that NATO has invoked the mutual defense condition, which says that if any country is attacked by cyber war, all the NATO countries have a right to react in response, so that therefore when the US and Israel carry out massive cyber attacks against Iran, that's an act of war which justifies a military response on their case. That's the omitted part of the story, but worth reporting. And as soon as there is in fact a kind of a concept of objectivity in journalism, which amounts to tell the truth about what's going on inside the Beltway. So report what the Democrats are saying and what the Republicans are saying, but don't go outside that. Then you're biased. You're not objective. And what's not objective in that sense is very commonly what's significant. And that kind of, it's not just government secrecy that prevents us from seeing what's going on in the world. It's our own obedience to the framework of conformity and that's established in part by things like a good education. We should be cautious about that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's such a privilege to be able to ask these questions, and I'm going to do a very short final question for each of the panelists. Ed, I'm going to start with you, and it's the same question I asked you when we first met a few years ago. Very simply, if you had it to do all over again, would you?
Absolutely, and I wouldn't have waited as long as I did.
Thank you for that. Glenn Greenwald, anything you would do differently? And did what you did help?
Yeah, I mean, when you decide to become a journalist, you become a journalist in order to do a story like this, where you get to shine a light on the most secretive agency within the world's most powerful government and trigger a debate around the world about incredibly profound topics like the danger of government secrecy and the abuse of power and the value of privacy in the digital age and the proper role of journalists and their relationship to government and a democracy. And not only would I do it all over again and do I feel very proud of and vindicated by what we were able to achieve, my greatest hope and actually my belief about what will be the most enduring consequence of the incredibly brave and noble choice of and the act of conscience that Edward Snowden made is not necessarily even what we were able to reveal in this story and not necessarily the document specifically that got revealed, but the way in which I think he teaches the lesson that no matter how much you are without privilege and position and power, no matter how obscure you think you are, no matter how powerless you think you are in the face of injustice, that all individuals have within themselves the power to stand up to even the most formidable institutions. And I think that the courage that he displayed, I know it was contagious for us as we work with him. And just as he was motivated and inspired by people like Daniel Ellsberg and Chelsea Manning and Thomas Drake, I think there's going to be a lot of people inspired by Edward Snowden to come forward and reveal things that never should have been concealed in the first place.
Noam Chomsky, 6 decades of thinking and writing and scholarship. Is there anything you got wrong? Anything you want to revise? You get the last word. What's left to be said?
Well, instead of answering that question, I'll back off and answer a different one.
That's the prerogative of 6 decades.
That's it.
You get to a point where you're allowed to do that. In brief, I think what Edward and Glenn have done is a really impressive and magnificent contribution to our freedom and our democracy, and they should be lauded for that.
Thank you.
We're going to make a few final words. Thank you.